the quintessential British countryside. Peaceful, quiet, productive. But in 1959, that all changed when we decided we needed a series of intermediate range ballistic missile sites. The 20 sites, which were going to be armed with the American Thor intermediate range ballistic missile, nuclear armed, were constructed around the, not quite the east coast, but in the eastern part of England, on mainland Great Britain. And I'm at RAF Harrington, probably one of the best preserved of these sites. And in this video, we're going to have a look at the standing remains of the Thor missile site at RAF Harrington. So what we're looking at here is one of 3 of the Thor launch sites at RAF Harrington. Now this isn't going to be a complex history lesson on the ins and outs of the arrangement of the Thor missile and the development, other than really, I think I'll summarise and say the Thor missile was an American nuclear weapon. It was a liquid rocket with a nuclear warhead. The agreement from America that was supplying us with the weapons was that the rockets themselves, the launch sites and the decision to launch would be British. However, ownership and control over the warheads would still be American, so the British had no control over the warheads themselves, to the point where I believe in the launch centres there would be an American Air Force representative and a British Air Force representative working together, and 2 keys would need to be turned in order to launch the weapon itself. There were 20 sites around the east of the UK, each with 3 rockets. Not quite a battery. I think they're referred to as launch sites as opposed to artillery batteries. They would effectively have fired a single weapon from each site. There was no magazine, there was no separate storage. And to be honest, 60 nuclear weapons being fired in Western Europe would have been devastating enough. Never mind the retaliatory strikes. So they were effectively single-use launch sites when you think about it. They were on 24 hours readiness, so the crews were always manning the sites. There was always a rocket on the launch pad, albeit in the horizontal position, unfueled, and that meant that there was a 15-minute warning before any launch could take place. And I suppose in those 15 minutes would have been the political discussions about the launch and so on after Britain had decided to launch the rocket. So the rocket itself, when it's in its rested position, would have sat here. We have the two very distinctive blast walls on either side, and that was more, I believe, to try and protect the equipment on either side in the event of a filling accident. And I think in recent rocket events in modern years, most of the accidents on the launch pad happen during filling. So the holdfasts we see here would have housed the base of the the mount, the rocket, as I say, would have laid horizontally. But because we are in Britain and not every day is like this beautiful summer's day we have now, there was a large shed that sat over the rocket itself. And this whole area here, it looks like a runway, wasn't. It was purely to store the shed after it had been removed from the rocket. So if we look down here, we can see what would have been the remains of the rails and the track system for the rocket storage shed. So in its closed position, it would have been where I'm standing here, as I say, protecting the rocket. And then when it was to be exposed, the shed would go all the way down to the bottom of that concrete track. And if we look at the front of this emplacement as well, we can see some perpendicular rails, and these were for the doors of the shed. So the door section didn't retract. The door section went basically opened up to either side to clear the launch pad, and the rest of the building retracted. Right, so it now gets technically complex when trying to understand this site. So they were liquid fueled rockets. There was a fuel and there was an oxidizer of liquid oxygen. Now, keeping the two of them together was relatively dangerous, so rockets didn't tend to be stored, as I say, in that fueled stage. And the two fuels, or the fuel and the oxidizer, were kept very separate on the launch pad and during those filling operations. So on this side was the liquid oxygen site. So there was a liquid oxygen tank there with pipes running down under the ground, coming up from this flange here. And something you'll notice about the flange, it's stainless steel. So the oxygen would have oxidized anything it came into contact with. So we've got the output of the oxygen filling pipes there in stainless steel. Then on the other side would have been the liquid fuel on this side. And there is, I think we can see it in one of the other emplacements. I think it might be under here. So there we have the corresponding filling pipe for the liquid fuel. And that's really what the majority of this site was set up to do, was that complex and very volatile filling operation. The sites were pretty remote, everything was trucked in, so the liquid oxygen would have come in by truck, hence most of these hard standings were for those filling trucks. So they could come in, the oxygen trucks, which would then needed to have included pumping systems to charge the system and charge the rockets, would have been over there, as I say, with the liquid fuel on that side. And that's really all I'm going to say about this particular site. As I say, there are three of them in this location. The middle one is slightly better. It doesn't have quite as much rubbish, and we can see a lot more of the workings of that site. So yeah, RAF Harrington Thor missile site. We're now going to make our way round and skirt around the fields and go to the central launch site. We're now here at the middle launch site. The designation of these three at Harrington were LE50, that we're currently stood in, LE51, the launch site that we've just come from, and LE49, which is just over there, and we're going to go to that to finish off. It's always, I think, very interesting when we're looking at these sites to have a look at the rubbish piles, because the apple never falls very far from the tree in terms of rubbish when people are trying to get rid of them for no cost. So here, what we can see are a series of precast cement or concrete posts. So I'm imagining these were possibly from one of the precast buildings that may have been on site. I don't imagine they were from the covered rocket shed, but I imagine they may have been from one of the other buildings on site. So if you are coming to places like this, have a look around and see what lies about, because it will help give us some context to the makeup and construction of some of the other buildings, should you wish to go into that much detail. And here we are at the launch site again, much clearer than the last one. We had lots of rubbish piled up in the middle, but here we can see that holdfast very clearly. So that's where the stainless steel oxygen outlet would have been, and here's just the ordinary cast iron outlet for the liquid fuel that was on this side of the building. So let's have a look. We'll go and start over there. So they're quite away from the launch site itself, and as I say, there was pumping equipment to pump the fuel to the rocket itself. But if there was an accident and it did ignite on the launch pad, then at least you're not burning your bulk fuel. And here we go. So no tanks remaining. The holdfasts for the tank are likely to have been on the base here, and this is likely to have been some sort of bund to just to collect if there was a leak of fuel during filling or emptying of the rocket. It would have been self-contained here, because as soon as that oxygen mixes with the liquid fuel, you have combustion. So making sure that doesn't happen until you want ignition is pretty important. So we'd have had the liquid fuel here. All the equipment, the control equipment, the pumps and so on for the liquid fuel would have been contained behind this blast wall. And as far as I can ascertain, most of the equipment here was mobile, so it would have been truck mounted. It was only really the launch pad itself that would have that was built like this, and those storage tanks, I think, as well. Whether that was, this was always going to be a very short-term project. We were working on Blue Streak ourselves. We were trying to work on our own nuclear-armed ballistic missile after the free-fall weapons. We were also going down the free-fall weapon route, and the designs for the V-Force had, I think, just been agreed, but construction hasn't. They certainly weren't in service at the time we took on Thor as our nuclear deterrent in the country. So it was sitting in this really transitional period when we were trying to get our own deterrent sorted. And we have a look here. These are the mounting holdfasts for that. As I say, for the rails for that shed, that would have probably come up to, you can see this little ridge in the ground here. That was probably the rear wall of the shed, and then, as we saw on the other emplacement, we had the rails at the front for the front door for access in and out. And this thing would really have been huge. I think the shed was probably twice as high as these walls, and those walls would be 12, 14 feet high themselves. So the shed would have been large, because remember, it had to cover not only the rocket but also the launch platform as well. That would have been held here and then erected and filled within those 15 minutes. And I'm not sure then, as I say, most of the equipment was mobile, and I'm not sure if that was after the rocket was up and was ready to launch, the vehicles would pack up and leave the site. As I say, they were probably single-use sites, because at the moment you start to fire those weapons, we have pretty much all-out nuclear war, and I imagine the opponent's nuclear launch sites would be pretty first on the list to go. So this is the liquid fuel side. we'll make our way over and we'll have a look at the liquid oxygen side. Ooh, and this is, before I do that, here we have one of the survey points. So now this is something I'm probably going to get out of my depth trying to explain. So the Thor missiles used an inertial guidance system. So we didn't have global navigation satellite systems, GNSS, as we do now, of which GPS was the first iteration. They weren't guided by radio link or remote control. It was this inertial navigation system, as I say. So really it was very important that when the rockets were launched, and generally they were all pointing in that direction to go east, it was very important that they were properly aligned and that inertial navigation system was calibrated before launch. So that was one of the survey points as part of, so I believe there was a short range survey system, and then down at the far side of each launch pad there was I think it was a long range photoelectric or electrotheodolite. I'll have to check the plan I've got, and we'll have a look at that, and that was for more accurate calibration of the inertial navigation system. So we are now standing right at the back of the where the liquid oxygen tanks would have been, and we can see this concrete hard standing that comes up and goes around, and as I mentioned before, I believe that was purely so the filling trucks could come up, fill, and then it was easy for them to get away again. And this one unfortunately is pretty filled in with debris, but some of that debris, if I remember right, was quite interesting to have a look at. No, unfortunately, we're going to have to go to the other, the third launch site and have a look at some of the liquid oxygen features that are in the ground here. But I think what we can see is, I think this is the emplacement that has the some remains of that theodolite building. Now I'm going to have to look this up because see, I keep mentioning it and it's wrong. So we're number 3 in the plan. The long range electrotheodolite. There we go. The long range electrotheodolite building is just down here. And this is, as I say, this the sites are reasonably compact. So over here we have what was the pyrotechnic store and I think it was the special weapons store. So I imagine that's where the nuclear warheads themselves would have been stored. I'll have to try and read up, but I'm not sure whether the rockets themselves would have contained the nuclear warhead, but just not with fuel, or whether it was really just the shell of the rocket that was on the launch pad, and then when the 15-minute warning was given, the liquid fuel was added, the nuclear warhead was fitted, and then it was ready to launch. And if you just notice in the background there, that's the third launch pad at this site. Right, so here we have that electrotheodolite building, now demolished, of course, but we do see we have corrugated asbestos roof up there. We have rendered brick walls on the outside, and right in the centre is the plinth where that theodolite would have sat. And if I think I've interpreted some of the drawings and diagrams right, this is where this front wall, this is where the aperture would have been. We have the rocket down this side, and the theodolite was probably for aligning the rocket prior to launch. I assume it's assumed it'll fly in a particular trajectory or straight line. We need to make sure then that when it is launched, it'll fire in that line, and possibly like the German vengeance weapons of only 14-15 years prior to this system being installed, which ironically I think a number of German rocket engineers, quite a few hundred, moved to America to work on the American rocket program after the war. So I imagine they could estimate range or how far it's flown. So based on the fact that it's pointing in a particular direction on a particular bearing, and then the number of miles. I think these rockets had a range of 1,600 miles, I think, and that's flying at about Mach 4 possibly. I'm sure you can correct me down below if I'm wrong, which I probably am. Yeah, very simple system. And here, and it's just hard to believe that this whole area here was just to house the shed when it's taken off. The rocket. So yeah, not too much else at this particular central launch site, but we'll now make our way over to the third and final Thor launch site at RAF Harrington. Here we are at the final launch site, so much clearer than the rest of debris and so forth. So it might be an idea. What I'll try and do is talk through the sequence as best I can based on my understanding. So we have in here, we would have had the Thor rocket, and as far as I can establish, with warhead fitted but no fuel, on its gantry in the horizontal position inside a shed. The front doors of the shed were on rails here. They would have slid off to the right as we look at them. The main shed roof itself would then have started to be withdrawn all the way down on its tracks, right the way to the bottom of this pad. Previously, what had turned up on site were trucks with liquid oxygen that would have been parked over there, filling the main liquid oxygen tank there. The pumping equipment and so on would also have been mobile and brought in, probably on trailers or trucks. That liquid oxygen would have been pumped into the fuel tanks within the rocket itself via this stainless steel pipework. On the other side, we have the corresponding liquid fuel trucks. They would have been parked and pumping up and filling the liquid fuel tank, which would have been contained in that bonded storage over there. And that liquid fuel would have been pumped up into the rocket fuel tanks by this pipe here. Once the fuel was in, the rocket then would have been lifted to the vertical position, or sorry, I imagine it was probably lifted to the vertical position before filling commenced. So the rocket would have been vertical at this stage, as it would have been filled with the liquid fuel from one side and the liquid oxygen on the other side. And at this point, I'm not sure whether those vehicles would have left the area. Certainly the fuel tankers that would have filling the permanent tanks on site would probably have left, and the site would probably have been cleared of all non-essential personnel as they could. This tank here, I believe this was a liquid oxygen spillover tank. So whether too much oxygen went into the rocket itself or it needed to be evacuated, that liquid oxygen, I believe, went into this tank here. And you can see from this pan itself, we've got those ramped sides, which all lead down into this pit. And in here, I think all would have been maybe some pumps, some pumping equipment. As I say, we've got a ramp here. Maybe that was for bringing the pump trailers down, and then the main oxygen tank itself would have been up there. And here's the view from the liquid oxygen side. And then really, after that, I imagine everybody would have evacuated from the site, and launch would have taken place remotely, possibly from a launch trailer that would have been parked. I don't imagine it would have been parked here. There were some other ancillary buildings to the site. I think they're over in that direction as well. Before it was fired, I imagine the electrotheodolite would have been put into action just to line up the direction of the bearing that they wanted the rocket to fly in. And once it was launched, it was really on its own using that inertial navigation system. These are, as I say, fascinating sites. We've launch pad LE 49, 50 and 51. So 49, 50, 51 out of 60 Thor launch sites in the UK. The site itself is very accessible. There is a modern public bridleway running up part of the old, I think it must be the old perimeter track of the airfield, RAF Harrington being an old Second World War airfield. And I think the land was still requisitioned at the time whenever the Thor sites were placed out here. And there are pretty well trodden tracks up into around the launch sites. I don't see any signs that the farmer doesn't want people here. As I say, I believe it's the best preserved. It is a Grade 2 listed monument in the UK, even though it was only active for less than the duration of the Second World War, from I think it was 59 to 63 possibly. Yeah, so I'd recommend anyone in the area. I think I'm in Oxfordshire. Correction on the screen if I'm not. But yeah, well worth a visit if you're into this part of Cold War military history. So there'll be a couple of things that I'll stop and point out on my way back, but that's the bulk of this tour. We've seen all three, what remains of all three launch sites. As I say, they were pretty mobile. Not a huge much else other than the reinforced concrete remains to see. So we will head away over in that direction, and we'll see if we can see the pyrotechnic store and the classified weapons store, I believe. They sound more elaborate than they are, trust me. Right, so I'll see you over in that direction. So I've just found this in one of the rubbish piles. I'm not sure if anybody can recognize it, but it's basically a trig post or a survey pillar. It looks very similar to the Ordnance Survey posts, albeit maybe a little bit more squat. So that may have been one of the survey markers that was used, as I say, to align the rockets prior to launch. So yeah, just here in what was the liquid oxygen tank area of that final emplacement we just looked at. So yeah, say it pays to often look around and see what you can spot. So anyway, onwards. Now made it to the final part of site we're going to look at in this video, and this is the classified stores and the pyrotechnic store, which we'll have a look at. But here, so the Harrington Thor site, like many of the others, was built on a Second World War airfield, and I believe this was part of the perimeter track of that original 1940 era airfield. And you'll notice there are two gouge marks through the concrete just here, and matching up this area of concrete or taxiway with the plans of the Thor site. This was actually part of the inner perimeter. So there was an outer perimeter fence with essentially a sort of dead ground in the middle, a no-go zone, and then there was an inner fence line, and these two lines would have formed part of that inner fence line. And I suppose, you know, why gouge up if you're just building a wire fence with some posts? Why gouge up such a huge line? Well, actually what I think was the construction method here was, like many secure sites, is the fence, the wire mesh of the fence is actually buried in the concrete. You know, I'm sure we've all seen chain link fences where you can lift the bottom and squeeze under. This was to avoid it, help keep the tension on and stop people crawling under the fence. So this would have been the inner secure fence to the site. So large hard standing here. This is probably where vehicles could have parked and supplies could have been loaded and unloaded. And the two stores, as I say, there's the pyrotechnic store to the left, which will have to go around the back and up and over the bank to access. And then we have the classified, I think it was the classified weapons store in front of us. Excuse me. As for the exact purpose, special weapons, classified weapons and so on tended to be the name used for nuclear weapons, or the nuclear warheads at least. So this indeed may have been where the warheads were perhaps unloaded, inspected, or just at least brought here to inspect before bringing back out, before loading up onto the Thor missiles themselves. And as I say, this is in the most secure part of the compound. Now, if we have a look at the roof, and I think we'll notice the pyrotechnic store is the same. We've got two layers of asbestos sheets with corrugated asbestos in the middle. So very lightweight roof. We're surrounded by earth banks. If there was anything energetic happened in here, an accident, it would probably just blow the roof off and not out the ways, protecting people and protecting other stuff that's around. Rather large building. I'm not sure if there would have been an overhead gantry crane. I can't see any evidence for that. Quite often that's what I would have expected for if you were lifting ammunition or moving it. You'd use an overhead gantry crane to lift it off a trailer onto a bench or whatever. We can see this wall has fallen down. There would have been three walls with air vents. We can see them on the other side. So really quite lightweight, temporary construction, as this site really was constructed as a temporary site. It was only a stopgap until our own homegrown weapons were developed. A little bit of spalling. We can see these reinforced concrete panels or blocks that would have made this very lightweight building or garage. Some signs of electrics, and the fact that we see a little bit of conduit going up here suggests these were active air ventilators, not just air vents, but electric ventilators. And we can see some of this construction detail. You know, look how thin those wall sections are. They really are very thin indeed, and they've been tied. We can see the ties. There's a pile of them from the wall that's fallen down. I just tie them into the steel frame, into the girders. So yeah, there we have the classified weapons store, I believe, at RAF Harrington. And we'll now try and make our way up and over to the little pyrotechnic store just in here. And the only way to get up to the pyrotechnic store is up the earth embankment. This embankment constructed around both the classified store and the pyrotechnic store to really to protect the rest of the site should there be an accidental explosion in here. And here we are, tiny little building, little single cell building with some unusual features. So first of all, if we have a look at the roof, now I may need to come around the front to get a better perspective, but it seems to be double sheet asbestos with corrugated in between, and that's it. It's really light, it's a frangible roof, which means in the event of anything happening in here, an accidental fire, explosion, detonation, the blast goes up, it doesn't blow the walls out, but then it's also protected by the bank, and that shouldn't affect the rest of the site. As for what these supports are, the rest of the building looks very similar to small pyrotechnic stores we get elsewhere around airfields, but as for those little outriggers, I'm not too sure, possibly part of the lightning protection system, or there may indeed have been another level to the roof as well. We can see steel frame building with possibly precast panel walls. Actually no, they've probably been cast in situ. You can see the tie blocks holding the single skin wall. These would have been for air vents, very important, keeping the pyrotechnics dry, so that probably you've been air vents bottom and top to keep the airflow going. But a very simple structure and a very simple building, which is the pyrotechnic store, and that would be the normal access route, but it's just too brambly to try and get in. So what else can we see? We can see there was lighting fitted. We can see there's a bit of a light fitting above the door, and there would have been a steel door, possibly what I'm standing on now. There's something under the grass that feels like a steel plate door. So yeah, there is the little pyrotechnic store. And that really does now conclude this tour of the RAF Harrington Thor site. I'm aware there are some ancillary buildings elsewhere in the airfield. I just don't have time to get to those today. I'm not sure if there were any particular standing remains, but here from the top of the earth bank we can see position number 1, position number 2, and the third position here. We can see them all at once, and just admiring the rest of the beautiful English countryside. So that's it. That's all I've got for you in this one. I hope you enjoyed it. Hopefully, as I said, wasn't terribly detailed. It's a very complex time in history, but hopefully it's prompted you to do some reading and research if you weren't aware of this technology and of really the Thor missiles. I'm sure you're aware of the development of the British freefall nuclear bomb, and then moving to the Trident system later on that we still run today as a deterrent. Yeah, here we have it, RAF Harrington Thor missile site.